Hi friends, Lisa here with Green Hook Studio and another crochet video for you today. This one is going to be a little bit different than some of my other videos. I'm not doing a tutorial or the standard project. I am going to repair this blanket for a client. This was made by her grandmother. She's had it for over 30 years and she is devastated that this has happened. And I'm going to take care of it for her, and I am going to bring you along on the journey as I figure out all the steps I need to do to make it look brand new again as best that I can. So there's that one giant hole, and there is also this one. And then there's a few other places where I am going to shore up some things and just make it a little more sturdy and complete. So I will find some yarns that match these beautiful rainbow colors and get to work. So why don't you just join me in fixing this blanket? All right, you can see here that I've laid out the whole blanket to get a full view of what we're working with. It's a really large blanket and fills up my whole front hall. This is the first hole. It's the biggest one in between this blue and green section. And then there's another blue and green section up toward the edge of the blanket. And then a full view so you get the full scale of what we're working with here. All right, let's get to work. First thing I did was lay it out to see what I needed to do on the first hole. I'm working with the smaller blue section first. You'll see me counting the rows to make sure that I have all the rows and see what I need to recrochet and what I need to sew. I found a few tails that I was able to use to crochet this strip back on. So I am single crocheting this row and making sure to follow the pattern as well as I can on this chevron Afghan. Then once I got to this piece, I was trying to figure out how best to rejoin to the other piece of the row where it broke. And I took that out. I had to untie some knots. They were really stuck together after years of wear and washing. So I was able to get those out and then use the rest of that piece of yarn to crochet across and then not have to use as much of a new yarn that didn't match, quite perfectly. This other tail I just wove in to hide it so that it didn't come undone and create any problems in the future. All right, with that piece cleaned up, I'm gonna move on to sewing the pieces together here. I'm gonna stitch this hole closed using the tail of the original yarn. And I'm using a combination of a ladder stitch and improvisation so that I can hide the stitches in between the existing original crochet stitches. I want to make sure that these stitches look as much like the original stitches as possible. So I'm going to do everything that I can to be sneaky and hide these stitches, make sure they don't get pulled too tight, and also use as much of the original yarn as I can. Here you'll see me putting in my stitch markers. I used these to hold the chevrons in place to make sure that all my stitches line up properly as I'm working to keep things tidy and make sure that I'm in line as I go and don't have to redo anything if I get a little wonky on how things are lined up. So with my stitch markers in place, I went ahead and continued with my ladder and improv stitching all the way across that hole. Now I reached the end of the original yarn that was left, but I still need some yarn to sew with to finish up this hole. So you'll see me joining the yarn here using what some call a magic knot to add my new piece in. This was just a piece from my stash that I felt matched the original yarn the best. It is just ever so slightly different in color, and that's another reason why I try to hide the yarn as possible, to kind of sew in between the middles of the stitches to hide this new yarn so it doesn't stand out. So here I'm just continuing my ladder stitch, and then my knot gets caught, of course, which happens a few times because the original stitches are tight and they're also a little bit matted together just from wear and washing. Now I'm going to finish up this hole with some more ladder stitching, and there it is, basically finished. I just have to tighten up this last little section. You can see here where I'm going through stitches and scooping up these stitches from the bottom row, going through the loops so that they will not come unraveled in the future. But as I do my ladder, I also want to make sure that I don't pull too tight. I want to make sure that this looks like the original crochet stitches as much as possible. There's a little more improv involved as I finish up this little corner that's left. There's a few stitches that I will go back and forth in a few times just to make sure that they are really shored up, because this is where the rip had partially originated from. And I want to make sure everything really stays attached and really looks nice. Now I'm finished with the first part of sewing the hole shut, and so I'm going to tie a knot so that all these stitches are secured but also don't pull any tighter from the other repairs that I'm about to do after I tie this knot. I just wanted to make sure that everything was secure as possible because I don't want this to have to need repaired in the future. Excuse my head. And then I evaluated my work and how it looked and decided to go back through some of the stitches in the bottom row to just tighten them up a little bit. They had gotten stretched out when they were unraveled in the damage, and so they needed just a little bit extra support. Now that I've finished with repairing all of this blue section, I will tie a couple knots before weaving in the ends to finish it off. So I do a couple knots just, again, to make sure it's super secure. And then with my weaving in the ends, I go through the stitches in several directions. Depending on how much yarn I have left, I will do 2 to 3 passes with the needle in different directions to make sure that it's very secure and it's not going to pull out all those directions at once. All right, after cutting that off, I checked how everything looked, and I'm pretty happy with how it's come out. That's the section that I just repaired. Now I'm going to use my felting needle to just shore up some things that were maybe a little fuzzy or a little frayed or laying oddly that I just wanted to clean up. So what I'm doing with the felting needle is I'm not going straight down through because it's not a standard felting project. I'm going at an angle to tuck the yarn back into itself. And I just checked over what I did, see if there's anything else that looked like it needed help. And the blue section was done, so I moved on to this hole I found in the red. Since I just had a little hole and a little bit of the original yarn left, what I did is just weave in these ends. So I weaved in this one first, again going multiple directions to prevent it from pulling out in the future. And then I'll move on to the other string that's left out here. Weave that one in. And I was going to trim it, and then I changed my mind. I am going to felt these ends into place for extra security. So what the felting needle does is basically like makes the yarn Velcro to itself. That it rebonds the fibers. And so it's a great way to just hide a small loose end just back into the original yarn. And then I just trimmed some of the fuzz and extra pieces that didn't get worked in to clean that spot up a little bit. Now that that red piece is all cleaned up, I am moving on to the giant hole. This one was in the worst shape of all the damage, and I spent a lot of time just kind of laying it out and evaluating what I had to work with. You know, how many of the original rows were there? How much of the original yarn was there? How was it connected? What did I need to do? And then I found here there was a previous repair. I found it tied in there. There was this piece of yarn that didn't quite match the original blue and was also tied and not crocheted. So I cut that out. Then I kind of unraveled and untied that old repair. Then with that gone, I laid it out again to decide what my plan of attack was going to be. And I decided to go for sewing this green section together first because I felt like it was the most straightforward. So out come the stitch markers again to match up my chevrons so that I can sew them neatly together. With the chevrons joined together with stitch markers, I could lay this other piece out better, again, to look at what I was working with and make my plans. I really wanted to see what yarn I had and what condition it was in. After a little more planning, I decided to go ahead and match up this blue chevron as well. Again, to keep things together so that I could sew things back in place properly. For this more straightforward green section, again, excuse my head, I found a yarn in my stash that matched pretty well. So I joined that and just started with my ladder and improv stitching across this piece, making sure to go through some of these stitches. Some of them I had to tug at a little bit because they had been kind of matted in their frayed, unraveled condition. I'm just trying to make sure that I line the stitches up as best that I can to hide this repair. Some of the stitches, again, had gotten a little bit stretched, and so I went down through some of them to help shore that up a little bit, more than just the ladder stitching. Time for some more evaluation. What is happening here? This part was a little more complicated because of this tail. I had to make sure to keep it straight and not let it get twisted as I sewed things back together. Because these stitches were a little bit stretched as well, I had to just be a little bit more strategic in how I sewed them and how I picked up the yarn in certain places to shore things up and tighten them back up. But again, still hiding them and making them pretend to be crochet stitches. All right, now I've gotten to this tricky part right here. There's this piece of green that had gotten unraveled, but not completely. So I flipped the blanket around so that I could recrochet some of these pulled out stitches using this green yarn that was from the original blanket. So here I'll do a few stitches to get back over to where it had been. And then I'm going to use that tail from what I had been sewing to secure that last stitch and then continue sewing this row back together. Again, trying to keep it straight and not let that blue and green tail get twisted. It really wanted to twist. Every once in a while, I would just kind of take a pause, see how things were going, do a little bit of reevaluation for how things looked as I was finishing certain pieces of the repair. Over here, I wanted to make sure that I had all the rows intact, that they just needed to get stitched back together. And it seemed like that was the case. So that was kind of a relief, made things a little bit less complicated. But this tail was still bothering me. I double checked it a lot before I finished securing it in place. This knot at the end was bothering me. With this last piece of the tail to secure, I really wanted to make sure that I got through all these original loops in a very tight, secure, and tidy way to just make sure that they were not gonna go anywhere. And then I finished this piece off. I wove in this end. It was a good stopping place, but also I was about out of yarn on that piece. And that was just a stray piece I trimmed. All right, with that section done, it is reevaluation time again. What are we doing next? All right, I made the decision to go for this green corner of a chevron that was kind of jagged and pulled apart. So I wove these green stitches back together, again, back to my ladder improv to stitch these crochet stitches back together, but also hide my yarn to try to hide the repair as much as possible. Again, I did a lot of stopping to evaluate because this corner was not as straightforward of a repair as some of the others. Those were more of stitching the row back together with the row above it. This was attaching sides of rows back together. So it took a little bit more improv, a little more thinking, a little more pausing in between some of these stitches. Here you see me again trying to decide which thing do I stitch next? What am I working with? All right, we'll make a couple more stitches and finish attaching this row back to itself before I move on to the next thing. I kind of have to reevaluate every once in a while in between to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. I really want to make sure that this stretched stitch is secure. All right, looking good. Yeah. All right, let's start sewing some more stuff back together. Now that I have this green row back together, I can start sewing it back to its blue row above it. Again, with the ladder and improv, and making sure that I'm going through my stitches to hide the new stitches as well as to secure all the loops. Back to this troublemaker. This knot was a mess. I almost cut it, but I was determined to, again, use as much of the original yarn as possible for sewing and recrocheting where I needed to. I'm going to use that tail to resew this piece that's left over here. Watch me get super lucky. I don't know how I did that on the first try with that frayed yarn, but I did it. And I'm going to reattach this piece to itself back in its original home and no longer have this bothersome tail that was teasing me, just flapping around. It is getting secured in place with its original green yarn. And I feel really good about that. I love using the original. It just makes the repair look even better. So that was all the stitching I needed to do with that piece. So I'm going to tie it off and weave in the end. Now I'm doing the same thing up here using the original tail that was left to do a little bit more stitching before I move on with my extra new yarn. I must have taken a little time trying to thread the needle because I edited that part out. Just weaving this one in. I did a couple stitches to sew things together, but mostly I just am using this tail to shore up things and weave it in so that it's not loose anymore. I'll use my new piece of yarn to do more of the sewing. All right, how are we feeling about this? Oh, stray piece, give it a little haircut. All right, now back with my new yarn. I'm stitching the repaired piece of green back to the blue. There's a lot of back and forth as I needed to fix patches here and there before I could sew them back on to the row above them. But I'm feeling good and getting closer. Again, here I am with the ladder and improv going through loops, and pause for evaluation and layout. How we doing? What's happening here? Am I doing this right? Should I keep going? What's next? A couple more stitches. Just a little bit more green to sew before I get to blue. Is this it? Have I finished the green? Let's do a couple more stitches. Just get it extra secure. That's what this is about. All right, that piece is finished. I will tie it off with a little knot and weave in the end before tackling the next section. Here's the next section. It's blue time. So I get my new blue back out and lay this out flat, making sure nothing is twisted so that I can sew it all back together the best I can. All right, please stay flat. Do not twist. There we go. To kick off this blue section, I started by just weaving in the tail of the original that was just kind of hanging out to secure it and hide it. I just wove it back and forth a couple times. Very, very exciting stuff. And then after that is secure, I will rethread my needle with my new blue so that I can get started on my bigger repair. So again, I am weaving through the loops to make sure that things are really secure. Secure is the name of the game. I feel like I've said that a lot. Back and forth and up through, making sure that I capture all these pieces of the stitches. And again, going through them and not over and around any stitches because I want to hide the repair as much as possible. This section was a little bit trickier as it was more torn than some of the other sections that were more just pulled apart. So I went through multiple things. This was also near a chevron, so it was not straightforward. Again, with these, I'm sewing the sides of rows back together, not just sewing the top of one row to the bottom of the other. So now let's get this tail, this loose piece, secured in place. I'm just going to use my ladder improv technique, continuing on here to sew this together. And it was much easier once I had attached the sides back together. And then it stayed in place and lined up beautifully with the stitches below. You may notice that sometimes I am holding the stitch while I pull the yarn through. That just helps ensure that I don't pull my stitch too tight and mess up the look that I am going for. I want things to still look loosely crocheted. I want the blanket to look like these stitches have been loved for 30 years. I don't want any tight spots. So that just helps me control the tension as I stitch. Again, excuse my head as I look closely at this corner. And this stitch needs just a little extra love here to make the corner look nice. Again, controlling my tension as I pull. I'm just zigzagging back up through some of these stitches, again for extra security. That piece is now done, so I'm moving on to this last section of the blue that I have to work with. Continuing going through loops for security and then laddering to attach them. Back and forth. We're just going to keep doing the same thing we've been doing across this row to close this last section. no loop left behind. This is it. This is the last piece of the blue. Let's make sure it's extra secure so none of these pieces come apart again. It was a little bit of a struggle to improv this as I closed it because it wasn't very straightforward. This was where rows and columns were coming together, where things had been pulled, things had been ripped, things had been previously repaired, and then that repair was damaged. So this last little piece was a little tricky, and I just basically did my best. Trimmed some extra fuzz and just checked over things. Time to evaluate. With some evaluation, I decided I was going to bust out my felting needle again. So I slipped my felting pad underneath the repair and decided to lock in some of these loops that were kind of hard to sew together. This locks them in place and hides them just back in to their original spot. This just really helps clean up any last loose ends or weird loops that were hard to sew together. This is just the last little finishing bit. And again, I'm felting with my needle more diagonal or sideways than straight up and down, so that I'm locking the fibers to each other and also trying to not stab myself in the finger. With the felting done, I checked over my work to see if there was any extra fuzz sticking out or any other things that I needed to repair. And then I decided to move on. I next am going around the edges. I found there were some places where the yarns were tied off at color changes where the ends were coming out. So I used my felting needle to tuck them in where they were too short to sew. So again, trying very hard not to stab myself in the finger, I am felting diagonal or sideways and checking both sides as I work to make sure that they don't fuzz through on the other side, as they can with felting. Another reason to felt more diagonal than straight up and down. Then I checked over the entire edge. I go just all the way around the whole blanket, and I found ends that were sticking out a little bit and decided to shore them up so that they aren't sticking out any in the future, just to look nice, but also no risk of them unraveling. So there were a few spots to fix, but some of them look great, and I just moved on as I evaluated the entire edge of the blanket. Oh, here's one more to fix before I move on. Now I'm on side number 3. There didn't seem to be any damage on this side just because there were no joins. All the joins were on the other side that I checked first. This was where things were turned. Now here's the very top, the last side that I need to go through. Looking good. Check the corner. Corner looks good. All right, we may be almost done. All right, I laid the blanket out flat on the table and just kind of went over it and checked for any other spots that I may have missed. And this is now what it looks like. I am so pleased with how this has turned out. Can you see where the holes were? All right, the blanket is done. It is repaired. I even laid it out and asked my husband to find the repairs, and he struggled a little bit. So I'm very excited that I was able to do this for my client and hope to be able to do this for more people in the future. I love that I can do this for people to repair a family heirloom. This meant something to the family, and it was done with a lot of love by the woman who made it. And I'm really excited to return it tonight and get it back to being used and loved every day. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that you'll subscribe for more crochet and fiber content. Follow me on the socials for more at Green Hook Studio on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all the things. So thanks again for watching. See you next time.